I'm Paul Butler. I'm sitting here in the Mead Botanical Garden here in Winter Park, and to my right are some of Theodore Mead's creations, the Mead strain Amaryllis, the red and white striped bulbs, which were really throughout the southern gardens in the 20s were the Amaryllis of choice, because it's a very hardy plant and comes in white on red and red on white varieties. Theodore Mead was a very, very interesting and influential American horticulturalist. His memory is a little bit forgotten at the moment because he died in 1936, but before that he lived in Oviedo around Lake Charm area for the last 50 years of his life. I'm from England, and when I retired to Florida 5 years ago, we happened to buy a condominium. It just happened to be on South Pennsylvania Avenue, right opposite the pedestrian entrance to the gardens here. And my wife and I have been horticulturalists all our life, growing plants and shrubs and vegetables. And one of the things I wanted to do here in Florida was to grow orchids and bromeliads, and so I joined the local societies and started to find out about orchids and bromeliads. Also, I wanted to know who or what Mead was, because we lived opposite this wonderful community garden which was in a little bit of disarray in terms of its structure and planting, and it soon became clear to me that really no one knew who or what Mead was, and so I decided that I needed to find out for my own purposes. Theodore Mead, he was born in 1852, and he was originally from New York State, but all his life he wrote and received letters, and it turned out that in the archives of Rollins College were all his letters, so I started to look at those and try and assemble his life. How Mead Botanical Gardens came about was that he, in the last few years of his life, in the 1920s, he was a scoutmaster in Oviedo, and one of his Eagle Scouts was a boy called, or a youth called, John Connery, known to his friends as Jack. Jack Connery eventually became a student at Rollins College, and there he met Edwin Grover, which of course is the subject of this documentary film. Edwin Grover had known about Mead in the 20s. He'd visited his nursery and estate in Oviedo in the fall of 1926, and was a very keen horticulturalist himself, and he recognized the stunning sight of 5,000 orchids in Mead's collection in Oviedo. So with Mead's passing, Jack Connery and Grover put their heads together to try and figure out how to save this amazing collection of orchids. And it was Grover's ability to persuade 3 landlords and landowners in the Winter Park area here where we're sitting to donate the land to the city to create a legacy garden for Theodore Mead. So this area was cleared and made into a garden by the WPA program from 36 to 1940, and opened in 1940. Greenhouses were built, and all of Mead's orchids were brought from Oviedo to Winter Park and put in the greenhouses, and the garden opened in 1940 and was a big tourist attraction in those days. You must remember that orchids used to be hundreds of dollars each. This is before there was an orchid industry where you can buy it for you can buy an orchid for $10 in a big box store. They're produced on a production line. In those days, orchids were very much an expensive man's hobby, and to see 5,000 orchids in one place in 1940 was something really, really special. Of course, now it's quite normal to see arrays of orchids at flower shows and orchid shows. Mead was absolutely critical. His efforts were critical in terms of establishing the orchid industry. He started growing orchids in 1895 In those days, the problem with orchid growing was that you could never be certain you could germinate the orchid seed. Orchid seed was like fine dust, and the orchid seed does not have any food store of its own, and so germination was very much a hit or miss affair. So hybridizing orchids, in other words crossing orchids of two species, was very much a question of luck. So there was no such thing as the orchid industry in 1890 when Mead started growing orchids. So he's best known for helping to develop a system of test tube growing of orchids using an agar solution with nutrients and salts, and that happened in 1920. And it wasn't until that point in 1920 that the orchid industry took off as an industry, because then it was possible to guarantee germination of orchid seed. One of the key characteristics of Theodore Mead, he was very much old school in his thinking. He was a gentleman, and he was a scientist, and he was a curious observer, but he was not a self-promoter. This was a time when other people were promoting themselves, and maybe that's one reason why he's not particularly well remembered now. He would never dream, for example, when he hybridized a plant of naming it after himself or his wife or his daughter or something like that. All the plants that have Theodore Mead's name on were named by other people for him. So he's very much old school, and would not dream as Luther Burbank is a very well-known hybridizer, because everything he hybridized he called after himself. So that's probably one reason why Mead is not that well remembered.